The night was cold and quiet when they found him. Two guards were walking the edge of Ironveil village when they heard a sound near the old pine trees. A low, heavy sound, like something large falling against the earth. They raised their lanterns and moved closer, and that was when they saw him, a man. A very large man, lying face down in the mud, his back torn open with deep wounds, his clothes ruined, and his hands pressed flat against the ground, as if he was trying to push himself back up, but could not manage it. One guard wanted to leave him there until morning. The forest border was no place for strangers, and Ironveil had its own rules about outsiders. The other guard was not sure. They stood there arguing in low voices, while the man on the ground stayed still, barely breathing, and then a voice came from behind them. "Bring him inside." It was Alara. She was 26 years old, the village healer, and the daughter of the man who had written most of Ironveil's laws before he died. She had come out to check on a patient who lived near the border, and she had heard the argument from 20 steps away. Now she walked past both guards without stopping, knelt beside the stranger in the mud, pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, and waited. His pulse was there, weak, but there. "His name?" one guard asked. "I don't know yet," Alara said. "Carry him." The stranger was brought to her clinic, a small stone building near the center of the village that smelled of pine resin and dried herbs. She cleaned his wounds, stitched the worst of them, and gave him water when he stirred slightly near midnight. He was conscious enough to open his eyes once and say one thing before slipping out again. "I mean no harm to your people." Ilara wrote it down in her notes, the way she wrote down everything. Then she sat at her desk and waited for morning. By the time the sun came up, the village was already talking. News traveled fast in Ironveil. Everyone knew there was a stranger in the healer's clinic by the time breakfast was being made, and by the time Chief Aldrich called an emergency council meeting at the Longhouse, at least half the village had already formed an opinion about what should be done. Aldrich was a large man, broad-shouldered, with gray hair cut short and eyes that did not miss much. He had been the village chief for 18 years, and he had kept Ironveil safe through 2 border disputes, one very bad winter, and a dozen smaller problems that never made it into the history books. He was not a cruel man, but he was a careful one. "We do not know who he is," Aldrich said, standing at the head of the long table. "We do not know where he came from, or what happened to him. His scent is masked, which means he does not want to be identified. That alone is reason enough to send him back to the forest." Several people around the table nodded. Alara spoke from her seat near the end. "The law above our gate says we do not turn away the dying," she said. "Not for fear, not for pride. My father wrote that law, and the council accepted it, and it is still there in stone. If we break it the first time it becomes inconvenient, then it was never really a law at all." The table was quiet after that. Aldrich looked at his niece for a long moment. He had never been entirely comfortable with how much she sounded like her father. "3 days, he said finally. "He can stay 3 days. Long enough to heal, short enough to leave before anyone gets attached." The stranger's name was Kael. He gave no last name, no pack name, no home territory, just Kael. He said it the morning after he arrived, when Alara was changing the bandages on his back, and he was sitting up slowly, studying the room around him, the way someone studied a room when they were used to watching for danger. He was tall, very tall, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that carried a scar from somewhere older than his current wounds. His hands were calloused in the particular way that came from years of hard work, or hard fighting, or both. He did not speak much. When he did speak, he chose his words carefully, the way people did when they were used to every word mattering. Alara asked him nothing about who he was. She told him what she needed him to do. Rest, eat, stay off his feet for at least another day. And he listened and followed her instructions without argument. That surprised her. In her experience, large men with serious wounds always wanted to prove they were not as hurt as they were. On his second day, he asked if he could walk to the well for water. She said yes. On the way back, he passed the widow Sarah's yard. Sarah was 80 years old and trying to drag a heavy bundle of firewood toward her door. Kael stopped, set down his cup, carried the firewood to her door, and stacked it neatly against the wall, before picking up his cup again and walking back to the clinic. Sarah told 2 people. Those 2 people told 6 more. By evening, the village had heard about it. The third day arrived the way Aldrich had planned it, as a deadline. He came to the clinic after the evening meal, when the village was quiet and the lanterns were lit. He was polite about it, which somehow made it harder. He told Kael that the 3 days were finished, that he had healed enough to travel, and that in the morning he would need to be gone. The village had its own problems, its own concerns, and a nameless stranger with no clear allegiance was a burden they could not carry. Kael said he understood. He said it simply, without argument, and Aldrich, who had prepared himself for a fight, found that he had nothing to push against. What Aldrich did not know was that Alara had been standing in the doorway behind him. She had heard every word. After her uncle left, she brought Kael a proper meal, not clinic food, but real food, the kind she cooked for herself. She set it on the small table and sat across from him, and they ate in silence for a while. Then she put her fork down. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," she said. "But if you need one more day, I will get it for you." He looked at her. "You would argue with your own chief for a stranger." "I argue for what is right," she said. "That does not change depending on who is watching." Something shifted in his expression. It was very small, and it was gone almost before it appeared. "I will leave in the morning," he said quietly. "Your village is good, Alara. It deserves its peace." She nodded, and she went back to eating, but she thought about what he had said for a long time that night. The morning did not go as planned. At first light, 3 men arrived at the village border. They were from Greymoor, a larger, wealthier, more aggressive wolf pack 2 territories to the east. And they came carrying a formal message. Ironveil would recognize Greymoor's alpha as the superior authority over their territory by the next full moon, or face a formal challenge. The message was delivered with deliberate disrespect. The lead man dropped the written notice in the dirt rather than handing it over properly. He looked around the village with barely hidden contempt, as if measuring everything he saw and finding it small. And then his eyes landed on Kael. Kael was standing near the well with a water cup in his hand, watching. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He was simply standing there, looking at the Greymoor men the way a mountain looked at weather, without urgency, without alarm, and without any suggestion that it would move. The lead Greymoor man went still. It was not a visible thing, exactly. His words did not stop. His posture did not change. But something in him, something that operated below the level of thought, at the level of instinct, told him to look away. And he did, quickly. Without finishing his sentence, the 3 men left faster than they had arrived. Aldrich watched them go. Then he turned and looked at Kael for a long time. "Who are you?" he asked. Kael did not answer. He set his cup down on the edge of the well and looked out at the tree line where the Greymoor men had disappeared. "They will not come back tonight," he said, "but you should send a message to 2 of your neighboring packs before the week is out. You should not face this alone." Then he picked up his cup and walked back toward the clinic. Aldrich stood in the square and stared after him. Kael's departure was quietly postponed without anyone officially saying so. Ilara's younger sister Mira found him by the river that afternoon. Mira was 22 years old and had very little patience for silence or mystery, which was the opposite of her sister in almost every way. "Those men were afraid of you," she said, sitting on a rock beside the water. "Why?" "People are sometimes afraid of things they do not understand," Kael said. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." Mira studied him with the direct, unembarrassed attention that young people had before the world taught them to look away. "My sister thinks you are carrying something heavy," she said. "She said it the night you arrived. I thought she meant your wounds, but she didn't, did she?" Kael looked at the water for a moment. "Your sister is the most perceptive person I have met in a very long time," he said. Mira smiled. "I am going to tell her you said that." "Please don't," she laughed. And despite everything, despite the tension that had been sitting over the village since that morning, Kael smiled too, just slightly, just for a moment. That night there was a storm, a real one, the kind that came off the mountains in late autumn, with thunder that shook the shutters and lightning that turned the sky white for a full second before the dark came rushing back. The village gathered in the longhouse the way they always did in bad weather. There was a fire, shared food, and old people telling stories to children who had heard those stories many times and still wanted to hear them again. Kael sat in a corner and watched. He was quiet, but not the way people were quiet when they were uncomfortable. He was quiet the way someone was quiet when they were paying very close attention, taking in the way the elders were served first, the way the children were kept near the fire, and away from the cold drafts near the doors, the way even Aldrich's gruffness had a kind of protectiveness inside it when you knew where to look. Ilara sat beside him eventually. Not by accident. They both knew it was not by accident. She told him about her father, how he had built half the clinic's shelves by hand, how he had written the laws with the kind of seriousness that suggested he believed every word would outlast him, which it had. Kael listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, not waiting to speak, not planning his response. Just listening. When she was done, she asked him something she had not asked before. "What are you carrying, Kael?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then, "A kingdom, and the weight of whether I deserve to hold it." She did not flinch, and she did not look away. "You have been in this village for 5 days," she said. "I have watched you carry firewood for an old woman. Nobody asked you to help. I watched you fix a fence post in the rain, the morning after the storm, because it was leaning and you walked past it. I watched you say nothing, when my uncle was rude to you in front of everyone. Whatever you are somewhere else, here, in this place, you are what you do. And what you do is decent." He had stood in front of powerful people his entire adult life. He had made decisions that affected thousands of lives. He had faced things that would have broken most men, and he had not broken. Nothing had undone him like those words. The Greymoor wolves came back that night. Not with a message. Not with diplomats. They came at midnight, 12 of them, quiet and organized, and they moved directly toward the clinic, because whoever had planned this knew that the heart of a village was always its healer. Kael woke before the alarm was raised. That particular instinct had never left him, even in years of relative peace. He was through the clinic door before the first Greymoor wolf reached the outer yard. What happened next was not a long fight. When Bren and Torque arrived, running, weapons ready, expecting to help, they found Kael standing in the yard with 3 Greymoor wolves on their knees in the dirt and the rest already retreating into the dark trees. He had not drawn a weapon. He was standing very still with his hands at his sides, and whatever he had said to the men in front of him had taken all the fight out of them completely. He did not look injured. He did not look angry. He looked exactly like someone who had done this sort of thing before and found it very ordinary. The village was completely silent. Aldrich stood in the doorway of the longhouse with a lantern in his hand, looking across the yard at the man he had tried to send away 3 days ago. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and held the door open. "Come inside," he said. "Come and eat something." They came before dawn the next morning. 12 riders, their horses moving quietly through the morning mist. At their front was a lean older man in a long dark riding coat, silver-haired, with the straight-backed posture of someone who had spent decades in a formal court. He moved through Ironveil's gate without asking permission, and went directly to the longhouse, where most of the village was still gathered from the night before. And the moment he walked through the door and saw Kael sitting at the table with a cup of water in his hand, he crossed the room and went to one knee so smoothly and completely that the people around the table did not understand what they were seeing for a full 3 seconds. "My king," the chancellor said, "we have been searching for you for 9 days. The court is in crisis. You must come home." The silence that followed was the heaviest silence Ironveil had ever produced. Aldrich's cup hit the table. Mira's hand went over her mouth. Bren and Torque turned the same shade of pale at the same moment. The widow Sarah, who had been warming herself by the fire, sat down very slowly in a chair and stared at the wall. Ilara did not move. She looked at Kael. He was looking back at her, and for the first time since he had arrived, muddy and wounded and barely conscious, he looked exactly like what he was. Not a stranger, not a man with no last name, but someone who had been carrying a weight the whole time that was now suddenly visible to everyone in the room. He held her eyes for one long moment, then he stood up. He spoke to the village in the square. He did not stand above them on a platform or announce himself with ceremony. He simply stood among them the way he had stood all week, at the same level, in the same space, and told them the truth. He told them who he was. He told them about the ambush in the forest, men sent by political enemies who had scattered his guard and left him wounded and alone in unfamiliar territory. He told them that he had come to Ironveil's border half dead and been brought inside because a young woman had knelt in the mud and checked his pulse without asking his name first. He looked at Alara when he said that. She looked at the ground. "I have ruled 12 territories," he said. "I have held court in 30 cities. I have met chiefs and merchants and soldiers and scholars. I have never, in all of that, found a village that kept its founding law at the moment when keeping it was hardest and scariest, and most expensive to do. You protected a stranger who could have been anyone, who, as it turned out, was someone who can actually help you, but you could not have known that when you made the choice." He paused. "Ironveil's border dispute with Greymore is finished. I will handle it myself, and whatever this kingdom can offer you, safe roads, trade rights, a royal garrison nearby, you will have it. Not as charity, as something honestly owed to people who were good before they knew it would be rewarded." Aldrich stood in the front of the crowd. He was a proud man, and pride was not always a comfortable thing to carry. He had doubted this stranger. He had set a deadline. He had been rude and suspicious and slow. He put his fist over his heart, slowly, the old way. The village followed him, one person at a time, until the whole square was still. The horses were ready by mid-morning. Kael said goodbye to Mira, who told him sincerely and without embarrassment that he was much more interesting than she had expected kings to be. He shook hands with Bren and Torque, who stood straight and tried hard to look like men who had never considered leaving the Alpha King face down in the mud. He held Aldrich's hand for a moment longer than a simple goodbye required, and Aldrich gripped back hard, the way people held on when they were letting go of something they wished they had treated better from the beginning. Then he came to Alara. She was standing near the gate with her healer's bag over her shoulder, back in her normal clothes, looking as calm as she always looked, which was the thing about Alara that he had noticed first, and never stopped noticing. "My court physician is retiring at the end of the year," Kael said. "You are more skilled than anyone I have in the capital. And Ironveil is 2 days' ride. You could be back for every festival." She looked at him. "You are offering me a job. I am asking you not to disappear from my life," he said simply. "The job is the part that makes that a reasonable thing to say out loud." She was quiet. She looked at him for a long moment, the same steady, unbothered look she had given him the very first night, when he had been half-conscious on a cot, and she had been sitting at her desk writing notes as if nothing about the situation was unusual. Then she adjusted the strap of her bag. "Give me 2 weeks to train my replacement," she said. He smiled. A real smile, the kind that changed his whole face, the kind the village had never seen from him, because he had spent his entire time in Ironveil being careful. The Chancellor, standing nearby with the horses, had the good sense to look at the sky. 2 weeks, Kael said. Ironveil returned to its normal life slowly, the way a place did after something large had passed through it. The Greymore dispute was settled within 2 weeks of Kael's return to the capital. Their alpha was called to the royal court and given a choice. He chose to make things right rather than make them worse. Ironveil received trade rights, better roads, and a small royal garrison post at the eastern border, enough to make clear that troubling the village meant troubling the king. Aldrich had the law above the gate recarved in deeper stone. He told the stonecutter to make the letters bigger. He did not explain why, but everyone understood. Mira visited the capital 3 times in the first year, and maintained, with cheerful confidence, that she had known something was unusual about Kael from the very first day. No one entirely believed her, but no one argued. Bren and Torque were offered positions in the Royal Guard. They accepted. They also spent the rest of their lives being gently, affectionately reminded of the night they almost left the Alpha King in the mud by the border. Ilara arrived at the capital on the 14th day, exactly as promised. She had a bag of medicines, a list of plant sources she had already identified near the royal grounds, and the same calm expression she wore when she had made a decision and was completely at peace with it. Kael was waiting at the gate. He had been there for 2 hours. "You are on time," he said. "I am always on time," she said. He walked beside her into the palace, not ahead of her, not behind her. And whatever the court thought about that, and about the way the king was already smiling before he had even reached the throne room, they were all far too wise and far too grateful to say a single word about it. And in Ironveil, above the gate, carved deep in old stone, the law still stood. We do not turn away the dying, not for fear, not for pride. It had always been true. It had just never been tested quite like that before.